Good afternoon. Good morning, good afternoon to all of you. My name is Sandra Mignon. I'm working with Plan International as a CAFAG advisor. And I'm the co-lead of the CAFAG task force with Giovanna Vio, who is working with UNICEF. So today we're very pleased to welcome you to this webinar on prevention of recruitment of children in armed forces and armed groups. And this webinar is part of a webinar series that we have started last year on various topics that field practitioners have selected. Before we start, I'd like just to take a few minutes for some housekeeping information. So this webinar has interpretation available in French, Spanish, and Arabic. So you can select the language by clicking on the globe icon at the bottom of your screen with interpretation underneath. One of our speakers today speaks Spanish, so I encourage all even the English speaker to select the English channel so that you can you make sure you don't miss any information. So this so if you want to ask any questions to our panelists, we encourage you to use the Q&A function rather than the chat. So you can use the chat to introduce yourself, for example, if you feel like. But we recommend that you use the Q&A for all the questions to the panelists. So you should see it at the bottom of your screen as well. There's two bubbles with Q&A underneath. So this is the function where you can ask questions directly to the panelists, and then they can also respond to you directly. And if we don't have time to answer all of the questions, we will share the remaining questions on the community of practice, Change Makers for Children, that is dedicated to CAFAG. So we have a space online where we encourage you to register so that we can continue the conversation after the webinar. So we will post in the chat the link to the community of practice. So feel free to register even during the webinar, and so that we can continue talking about prevention afterwards. So today we will have a first speaker who will introduce what is prevention for child protection. And then Giovanna will facilitate a panel of 3 panelists who will share their experience on prevention in Nigeria, Mozambique, and Colombia. So without further ado, I would like to welcome our first speaker. So this is Chiara Ceriotti. She is the prevention focal point at the Alliance for Child Protection in Humanitarian Action. Chiara, over to you.
Thank you, Sandra, and good morning or good afternoon, everyone. So I'll take the first part of this session to speak about prevention, and I hope I can share my screen because I wanted to start from an image to put the things in a frame. And you can read also on your screen a quote from by Desmond Tutu that explains this image. But just to say that when we talk about the prevention, what we want to do is to shift our focus from pulling out the people who have fallen in the river, from going upstream and search for the cause and why they fall in the river and how to prevent them from falling. But what it means when this is applied to child protection in humanitarian action. And in order to do so, I want to show you a very short video that was produced earlier this year by the Alliance, and should give a quite good explanation of what prevention in child protection and humanitarian action is.
During humanitarian crises, such as armed conflict, natural disasters, and other crises, children are often the first victims and pay the highest price. The Primary Prevention Framework outlines 3 levels of prevention that can be implemented to prevent harm to children before it occurs. And in this video, We will briefly look at what these are. Primary prevention addresses the root causes among the population to reduce the likelihood of harmful outcomes. The target group is all children in a community or population rather than individuals. In primary prevention, sometimes a subgroup of children can be targeted as well. An example of this would be NGOs running family strengthening sessions for all families in a refugee camp. These sessions support positive interactions among family members and help to raise awareness around child maltreatment and healthy child development. Secondary prevention addresses a specific threat and/or vulnerabilities of children identified as being at high risk of harm. Rather than targeting all children in a population or subpopulation, secondary prevention identifies children and families at high risk of harmful outcomes and addresses the root cause of harm for those specific children. An example of this would be local organisations identifying an adolescent girl with a form of disability in a single-headed household as potentially at risk of sexual violence or exploitation, and referring her to life skills sessions for adolescents at risk of harm. Tertiary prevention targets individual children who have experienced harm and aims to reduce the longer-term impact of harm and reduce the chances of recurring harm. An example of tertiary prevention would be local organisations in a refugee camp identifying and then assisting a displaced child who is separated from family and is being cared for by an elderly woman. This assistance could include the child receiving case management support, including psychosocial support and referral to other necessary services, the adult receiving livelihood support, and the care arrangement being formalised as appropriate to the situation of the separated child and the adult. To find out more about prevention within child protection in Humanitarian Action, please visit the Alliance for Child Protection in
Great. Let me go back to my slide. Yes. Yes, so this was just a short introduction to prevention in child protection in Humanitarian Action. As the video says, when we do prevention, we want to look at the root causes of a harmful outcome. Let's say in our case today, child recruitment, and look for the risk factors and the protective factors that are either contributing to recruitment or are protecting children from a certain harmful outcome. But how to do so, and what is important to consider in prevention programming? So first of all is to identify the risk and protective factors that contribute to that harmful outcome. So maybe one thing I would ask you to do is maybe to drop in the chat like the first risk factor in your context that comes to your mind when you think of child recruitment. Let's see if we have anything in the chat yet. Yes, indeed, I see some inputs already coming, like economic inequality. Indeed, and many more, no access to education. And these are really good ones that we will take with us through the presentation. We know that there are some common risk and protective factors that we can find across contexts, but it's also very important to look at what risk and protective factors are very specific to the context where we work in. And not only this, but also looking at different risk and protective factors across multiple levels, according to the socio-ecological model. You will see in this model like one additional level to what we are used to, which is the last one on international and regional, which was found during the desk review that was done to develop the primary prevention framework. And just to give some examples, like of risk and protective factors. So you will see in green the protective one, and in purple the risk ones. Going from the child level, like a sense of esteem, or on the other side, desire for meaning and glory. And then looking at the family, community, and the society level. Now, in any context, children can be more or less vulnerable to recruitment. When a child is exposed to a higher number of risk factors than protective factors, then their vulnerability to recruitment might increase. On the other side, being like having several protective factors in his life and experience can act as a counterbalance, and so protect them and lower the risks of recruitment. What then, after identifying risk and protective factors? Then it is very important, like, to rank them, like to understand, like, what are the top risk factors that are pushing children towards recruitment, and what are the top protective factors that are protecting children from being recruited, and therefore understand like what they are those factors we should focus on to lower risks of recruitment. So, for instance, out of all the ones we saw before across the socio-ecological framework, here you find a few examples of some factors that, if addressed, could eventually decrease the chances of child recruitment, like working on positive relations with the caregivers, or improve the sense of belonging to a community, or the sense of self-esteem at individual and child level. But what more than ranking risk and protective factors? Then it becomes very important. When we say ranking them, we really look at the impact. So which factors will have a major impact on preventing an harmful outcome, on preventing child recruitment. But on the other side, we also want to analyze our risk and protective factors by feasibility, looking at the resources we have and what we can really address. For instance, you might have some factors that might have a very high impact on child recruitment, but they might be very difficult to address from a feasibility point of view. And these are the factors that in these two axes matrix you will find in your quadrant A. And then you can have some factors that maybe are identified among your long list, but might be low for impact and for feasibility, or those that might be very feasible to address, but addressing those will have a low impact on decreasing chances of recruitment. And finally, you might have factors that by analyzing them, you will find that working on those will have a high impact on preventing your issue. And on the other side, they are also very feasible, because it's maybe something you can address directly in your program with your resources, or maybe through partnerships with other sectors and actors, or maybe through advocacy. And so the next step would be to understand, like, then what factors we want to address. And like, if you had to choose among these four quadrants from A to D, which one to focus on to develop strategies and activities to address risk and factors and strengthen protective factors, like, which quadrant would you focus on? And maybe you can drop just the letter in the chat to see if we are in agreement. Yes, exactly. Quadrant D. So you want to go and develop strategies that address risk and protective factors that score high for impact and high for feasibility. So then your next step, and here you can see like where that quadrant is. What would be then the next step? Develop a contextualized theory of change and your prevention strategies. Now, to make it very easy, like for a theory of change, we really mean like to identify like what activities that if we do them, we will see a change happen because of some causal relations. So looking back at our example, which is not based on any specific context, but for instance, if we decide to work and put in place activities that focus on youth empowerment at the individual level, on positive parenting skills and family level, on youth-led projects at community level, then we assume that we will prevent children from being recruited in armed forces and armed groups, because we already saw that poor relations with the caregiver is one of the major risk factors that leads to child recruitment. And we know that a sense of esteem and sense of belonging to a community are major protective factors that protect children from being recruited. Now, it is maybe one consideration to make that both for response and prevention programming is very key to a theory of change that is very much contextualized, and so really looks at what factors have high impact and feasibility in your context, but also a theory of change that works at different level in the socio-ecological model, because it was found that working only at one level might not bring a good or important impact, as instead you would have like working at different levels. And of course, you would want like your theory of change as well as your identification of risk and protective factors and ranking by importance to be done with communities in a participatory manner. One more consideration, when developing the primary prevention framework, and so doing both a very extensive desk review and consulting child protection practitioners, there were 8 key principles that were identified as good ones for aiming to have effective prevention programming. Now, we somehow talk about some of them like already in this presentation. And so, for instance, starting from number 1, like the importance of identifying risk and protective factors in the context and what makes sense in that specific situation. Or the second one on working across the different levels, the multiple levels of the socio-ecological model. 3, using a multi-sectoral approach for measuring outcomes, and so meaning that while it might be difficult measuring prevention in the sense that you want to measure something before it happens, so that is not happening because of a result of our activities, we can still measure like changes, like the decrease in some risk factors or the increase in some protective factors. Or 5th, using a strength-based approach, so really building like on the protective factors that we identify in the context, or building like on the resources that are there, or on child well-being. 6th, facilitate community ownership. 7th, be child-centered and inclusive. And 8th, bridge and build a link between humanitarian and development systems. All of them can be applicable to prevention of child recruitment, but I wanted to specifically highlight 2 of them because they are also mentioned as key prevention approaches for preventing child recruitment in the CAFAG program development toolkit. And one of them is number 6 on facilitate community ownership, which in the toolkit is described as supporting community members to be able to protect the children. On the other side, recognizing that often in conflict situations, community systems and mechanisms might be weakened, and the communities may become a risk themselves for children. So it would be very important to assess the situation of the community, the mechanisms that are present, understand how naturally those communities protect children, who the influential people are, and how to strengthen those positive mechanisms that are already existing. The second principle that I would like to highlight is use a holistic and multi-sectoral approach. Again, because it is identified as one key approach to prevent child recruitment as per the CAFAG Program Development Toolkit. And so highlighting the importance of building collaborations and partnerships with other sectors, because preventing child protection harmful outcomes, and in this case, child recruitment, is a responsibility of everyone, not only in child protection. And going back maybe to some of the risk factors you identified at the beginning in the chat. For instance, it was said that one risk that can lead to child recruitment is lack of education opportunities or lack of access to livelihoods, which are all factors that sit with other sectors. And so as a child protection, actors will play an important role on building those partnerships, doing that analysis, and having other sectors on board to address the issue. And if maybe that is not possible in terms of intervention, maybe there are still chances to focus on strengthening advocacy, but really strengthening the concept of how these and working on child protection issues is everyone's responsibility. Now, one very last piece of information to close this presentation, and is where you can find information on prevention. So on the Alliance website, on the prevention page, you can find key documents on prevention, like for instance, the desk review, the primary prevention framework with its annexes, and a guidance on identifying and ranking risk and protective factors, which can be used during your needs assessment and situation analysis phase. But finally, I also want to highlight the CAFAG Program Development Toolkit, where you will find a specific chapter on prevention programming to address this specific child protection harmful outcome. And here I stop, but happy maybe to answer possible questions in the chat. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Chiara. Thanks for an excellent presentation. This is Giovanna. I'll introduce myself again. I work with UNICEF as CAFA consultant, and I co-lead the CAFA task force with Sandra. So welcome, everyone. So after this presentation from Chiara, we now have the opportunity to listen to three panelists from three different organizations who will be telling us how they have identified and addressed risk and protective factors for the prevention of recruitment and use through their programs. So first of all, let me introduce Marianela Fuertes, a human rights lawyer and research advisor at the Dallaire Institute for Children, Peace and Security. Marianela, hi. You will be talking to us about the Dallaire Institute's Knowledge for Prevention project, and in particular about the early warning to early action model. You're very welcome, and thanks for joining us today. The second speaker is Juan Jose Castellanos, program manager at War Child Holland in Colombia. War Child Holland in Colombia has been prioritizing the recruitment and use of children by armed actors for a number of years. And Juan today will be talking to us about the approach the organization has taken to and used to fully understand risk and protective factors before designing their interventions. So hello, Juan, great to have you here. And finally, our third panelist today is Dennis Ekwere, Executive Director of Children and Young People Living for Peace in Nigeria. Your organization, Dennis, is a youth-led organization working on the prevention of recruitment and use and other child protection issues. And we look forward to hearing about your approach too. Welcome. So I will ask our three panelists a couple of questions, and I have to stress on the time constraints, so I will kindly ask you to please keep to the 3 minutes for each of the questions. So first, I will start with Marianela. Marianela, hi. Could you tell us, please, what are the risk and protective factors that you have addressed with your project, and you're still addressing with your project? Over to you. Thanks.
Okay. Hello, everybody. Thank you for the invitation. I'm going to read the description, so I try to keep my time properly. So, research has shown that army violence dramatically increased children's vulnerability to being recruited and used by army groups. Exploiting children and exposing them to violence can increase the likelihood that they will engage in violent behaviors in the future. Preventing recruitment and use in first place is the paramount to breaking circles of violence and improving the protection of children and communities in fragile and vulnerable environments. Effective prevention requires timely, reliable, and systemic data on what making children susceptible to recruitment and use. Even though the recruitment and use of children is a distinguished factor of the modern conflict, there are concurrently no early warning systems that include children-centered indicators that precede recruitment and use. To address this gap, the Dallaire Institute Knowledge for Prevention research project has created the first early warning predictive model that helped identify combinations of factors that increase or decrease the likelihood that children are recruited and used. Understanding these factors and how they interact with one another remain key to developing timely and collaborative early actions to prevent conflict escalations, inform conflict mitigations, and improve child protection mechanisms. The early warnings to early action predict model used to monitor and warn on situations of concern leading to programmatic intervention and partnership. The aspects are identify global patterns in recruitment and use, identify factors that increase or decrease the likelihood of recruitment and use, situational factors linking to the non-state army group histories, control, activities, and file presence, identifying where recruitment and use are more likely to occur in the near future. Our research strengthens the predictive model, the Dallaire Institute capacity to prevent recruitment and use increase. As we become aware of early warning signs, we engage with key in-country experts to validate or repudiate our concerns. If our concerns are validated, we work with key partners to identify viable response pathway to prevent the recruitment and use of children. We applied the model in Cabo Delgado, that is Mozambique. In January 2020, the first version of our predictive model predicted a very high probability of recruitment and use in Cabo Delgado, a province of northern Mozambique. As a result, and based on our early warning to early action process, our research team engaged with the experts on the region and confirming that there was evidence of recruitment and use by the militants of the group ASWJ in Cabo Delgado. Through our advocacy effort, a tripartite agreement between the Dallaire Institute, UNICEF, and Ministry of the Defense, Mozambique was signed in September 2021. With support from our strategic partners, the Dallaire Institute began training the Mozambique Defense Forces on how to prevent grave violations against children by creating child protection focal points. We have strained the capacity of the security sector to intervene early to prevent the recruitment and use of children in Cabo Delgado. So I leave in there. So for the others, and
you've done great. Thank you so much for the timekeeping, and thank you so much for this very interesting contribution. And we will come back to you to ask a bit more about the application of the model in Mozambique. And now I would like to ask Juan the same question. So Juan, could you please tell us what were the risks and protective factors that you have addressed with your project? Thank you.
Sure. Thank you, Joanna. I just want to give a little context about where we are working and who we are working with. We are working with indigenous communities and Afro-Colombian communities in the Pacific of Colombia, so in Chocó, which is, of course, a department with many risk factors that we cannot actually address as an organization, but that we can still advocate for, and that I will mention through my presentation. Also, one thing I wanted to mention before is that we are really in a learning path with these communities on how to understand risk factors with an ethnic approach, and also with the gender approach to ensure that we really understand and address those factors. So the first one that we have identified through the program that I am talking about, it's a loss of connection of children and adolescents to their community, ancestral vision, and worldview. So this is referred to identity, how they are losing traditional identities, how they do not feel connected to traditional identities sometimes. And this has been perceived within the community, but also within adolescents and youth as a risk factor. A very big one and important one is that there's a deterioration of intergenerational relationships. So adults and children and adolescents are not talking as much and are not understanding each other really in these communities. There's a deterioration of social fabric and trust-based relationship within those communities, and also of trust within communities that are nearby, and this is a clear impact and affectation of the armed conflict. There's this one, which is very much inaccessible to us as an organization, which is inequality and lack of access of opportunities or access to services. But one that it's very important to us, and is that a lack of possibility of visualizing a future. This is conceived as a risk factor also. A low perceived value of oneself in the community. So for children and adolescents who are not perceiving themselves as valuable. Lack of trust in prevention routes, in institutional prevention routes. Of course, high presence of armed groups, gangs, and dispute between those armed groups and gangs. Lack of connection of different actors of a protective environment. So sometimes the indigenous groups, indigenous guards talk are very well structured, but they do not talk to other actors which are relevant. And of course, the presence of illegal economies here in Colombia is, and this is not only mean drug trafficking, but also illegal mining and other things. What we have identified as protective factors, of course, is a little bit of the turnaround of this. So if there's a strengthened individual and community identity, we think that it's less probable that they will be recruited. Strengthened intergenerational relationships with non-violent, effective communication. A community which communicates and it's integrated and trusts each other is also one thing that we think prevents recruitment. A connection between community care routes and a formal protection system routes. Also, if the adolescents and children have a vision of a future with opportunities that seem accessible and that are aligned with their worldview and interests, and a protective environment which really connects and communicates and articulates for the protection of children. And I will leave it there.
That's great. Thank you so much, Juan. This is a very interesting approach to identify risk and protective factors to strengthen interventions, focus on preventing the recruitment and use by armed groups. And I'll see some similarities in a way with what is coming next. So I'll hand over to Dennis now. Dennis, could you tell us about the risk and protective factors that you have addressed with your project?
Okay. Thank you. Our organization works with young children and young people, specifically at the grassroots and local level. So the risk factor we have been trying and attempting to achieve has been specific on two issues around substance abuse among young people, religious intolerance through hates and dangerous species from community leaders, religious leaders. And so those two are the risk and protective factors our program has been targeting and addressing. And so we identify substance abuse among young people as a risk factor that can expose them to the vulnerability of recruitment. And so we try to address that. We try to prevent them from getting into substance abuse use. And so that is one thing that we really give attention to in our prevention strategy. And we also know the influence of local community leaders on the locals. And so we try to see how we can use them as powerful entry points where we can influence young minds via what the leaders speak, what they say, and how they live. Because the children are watching their leaders, and so they copy them, what they do. So we want to use them to speak peace to the communities, to speak religious tolerance, to speak peaceful coexistence, to speak to the understanding that we have difference in our way of life, in our belief systems. And so we promote, through that we also see how we can promote unity in diversity. So those are the risk factors we have been addressing. They are small, but the impact are greater than what we imagine. So I give it that point, I leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Dennis. They're not small. I mean, they certainly look at how to put patches and focus on community interventions that are obviously we know that are critical in order to strengthen social cohesion. And I hope you'll be telling me about your approach to sport as well. With the next question, I'll ask you that because I was really fascinated to hear about the role played by football as well in the same communities, together with the dialogue, the interreligious and interethnic dialogue you've been mentioning. Thank you so much. So I think I will move on to the next question to all the panelists, and then we can have a bit of a reflection and Q&A from the audience if time allows. So I will ask the question and then I will ask our panelists to answer in sequence. So I'd be curious to know what were the results of your interventions in terms of prevention of recruitment? And have you seen any changes? And if so, what were these changes? And I'll start with Marianela again. Marianela, over to you.
Thank you. I wanted to mention different aspects about our experience in the Dallaire Institute. I think in the first change that we has been seeing is, for example, what we are presenting now, that the world start to talking about preventions, instant to protections, not because it's the spy, but it's a way that we needed to really address in terms to stop the recruitment of children and use in army violence. So has been part of that conversation and that shifting from, okay, we can have a lot of instruments for protection, so how we are gonna instrumentalize and operationalize those instruments in a prevention way. So one example is co-developers in 2017, Vancouver Principles of Peacekeeping and Prevention of the Recruitment and Use of Children's Soldiers. The Dallaire Institute is a global leader as substantial matter expert on recruitment prevention. More than 100 countries has endorsed the Vancouver Principles, which strengthen normative frameworks by protecting children in army conflict and operationalize children protection with the UN peacekeeping by recognizing the unique challenges possessed by the recruitment and use of children in conflicts. Endorsement governments commit to ensuring that all peacekeeping militaries or police and civilian staff receive the necessary preparation to take appropriate and prevention actions. So, and that's one of the main streams that we are using to developing conversations, relationships, and encouraging domestic law to improve the security forces' role in terms to prevent recruitment and use of children. We also produce a monthly worry list that is for internal work in the Dallaire Institute. As I mentioned, through that work, we are monitoring situations around the world with those factors that I rapidly described at the beginning. And through that, a monthly worry list, we prioritize, which countries and which society we should approach and what kind of approach. In that way, it's not like one avenue to work in. It's just according what is going on and developing relationships with the area. We start our contacts in specific countries to develop what kind of path from the early warning to early action will be possible. So as I mentioned, in Mozambique was one of the examples. And from today, since September 2021, 103 Mozambique military personnel, male and females, because the gender approach is one of the characteristics of our work, successfully complete the Dallaire Institute Foundation training course on how prevent the recruitment and use of children. 33 children protection focal points were training on how to monitor and report on grave violations against children to strengthen the capacity to prevent the violations from occurring. And 29 Mozambique military trainings complete the Dallaire Institute for training for trainers. So we are now expecting to continue training that we expected that the country will be able to take the tools and develop and continue their own exercises as making an integral approach for the security forces and for the protections laws that are already they have. So I leave it there.
Thank you. That's brilliant, Marianela. It would be great to have time to expand, but I hope that even including if there are questions from participants that we're not able to answer today, you might be able to perhaps expand on some of this and give other examples by continuing the conversation on the community of practice. And I will mention this in a minute. Let's now hear from Juan on the same question. Juan, do you want to tell us a bit about how the results, any results you've seen from the project?
Thank you, Joanna. I want to give credit also to the local and ethnic organizations who have worked with us and which have made this possible, and also to UNICEF, which is a joint program that we did. So what we did in this program is we basically tried to address the socio-ecological system. So we provided capacity strengthening with a strong ethnic approach and based on arts and sports for children, adults, caregivers, and traditional authorities. We developed community care routes in a participatory manner, and in connection also tried to connect throughout the process with the formal protection system care routes that exist in Colombia for the prevention of recruitment, which is actually very, very important. We worked on psychosocial support, and this is also a key point, to improve self-esteem, intergenerational relationships, and effective communication and trust-based relationships. We also work with the government institutions that are in charge of preventing recruitment. So we improve their technical knowledge and support them, formal protection system teams in charge of the prevention of recruitment to ensure connection with community protection structures and a more coordinated and accurate response. last but not least, which I think is very important, we work through youth-led and adolescent-led initiatives. And these initiatives were based in arts, sports, urban arts, and also cultural aspects of their communities. What examples are, of course, it could be teachers printing. We worked through traditional cultural arts. There were youth-led sports initiative also in this initiatives part of the project that we just finished. What changes we've seen, and this is also a very nice and also good to see that what we're doing actually gets to some changes. We found that there's a perceived increase of the sense of protection and an increased positive relationships from children and adolescents with family from the pre-test to the post-test that we did. So they now feel that their families really care more about them, and that actually their communities are more involved in their protection. There's a better identification of places of potential risk and also potential risky situations through the capacity strengthening. There was an improved perception of participation and of being heard by their communities, this through the initiatives mostly. There's a better perception of the role in their communities, so they feel valued and they feel that there's a role for them to play in those communities. Also, they now perceived a better perception of a future without violence, and this is also very much thanks to the initiatives. For example, some adolescents and youth groups continue to print t-shirts, and they are trying to find out more opportunities to do this. And finally, an increased recognition of community care routes and a perceived importance of the linkage with the formal protection care routes. And I will leave it there.
Thank you very much, Juan. Sorry to make you feel rushed. And last but not least, Dennis, over to you again to tell us about the results of your intervention and any changes that you've seen, any possibly positive or even negative changes, but over to you.
Yes, the results that we've gotten from our projects and from our initiative, as in the community where we work, there have been reduced cases of rape cases in the community, and you can link rape to substance abuse most times when a case arises. So there's been a significant reduction of rape cases, reported rape cases and occurrence within the communities. There's also been a reduction in gang rivalry, armed groups fighting between themselves. There have been a reduction because we've been able to, our program has been able to address the entry of young people into armed violence gangs within those communities. And so we have also noticed more boys and girls being enrolled into schools. And so we also take notice before we start our programs, we also take notice of school enrollment. So after our programs, we see what significant improvement has occurred in between that period. And so we'll be able to track that there's been more enrollment of boys and girls into schools. And most of them are beginning to take their lives more serious and begin to have passion for excellence, passion for success, passions to become who they want to be, passions to dream again. And so we begin to see that the changes. Within the communities from our program, we organize interfaith, inter-ethnic constructive dialogue sessions for clerics, community leaders, youth leaders, and men leaders. We engage them in dialogues, and so we noticed that the communities, they have been able to coexist peacefully than before. People can begin to understand their differences. People can begin to show respect to people's opinion and people's belief. Community members are able to know where, when, how to ventilate their grievances, and where to local structures, where they can report issues of violations, human rights violations, and get addressed before it escalates. And so these are things that were not there before. So thank you.
Thank you. Let me just ask you about the football. You've not mentioned it, but I was really keen that you explain that. Please.
Yeah, we also use football, you know, to do our programs. We use sports, but specifically we use football because football attracts the attention of young people. So we use it to address issues around drug use, substance abuse. Thank you.
Yeah, no, that's great. Thank you. Thank you very much, Dennis. And thank you, everyone. I mentioned the football because it's actually, I've seen some similarities also with the approach used in Colombia and outlined by Juan, in like how sport activities can have, you know, an actually a very critical role in supporting, you know, the reestablishment of this social cohesion when there is obviously a deterioration of the social fabric of the society or the community. Thank you very much for these contributions. Marianela has given us a little bit a more overarching idea of how prevention of recruitment and use can be done with the use of early warning indicators, which I find really interesting. And she's explained how in Mozambique they've been able, through this the identification of this risk factors and protective factors, also to set in motion some action processes, and including advocacy, capacity strengthening for different for armed forces, but as well as peacekeepers and so on. So I think that's great. And then for Colombia and Nigeria, two different contexts, but still a lot of commonalities in terms of the risks and protective factors identified in connection with recruitment and use of children. And I really liked as I said, that was one of my highlights, the role of sport, but also the use of intergenerational dialogue and promoting respectful communication as some really strong strategies for prevention of recruitment. So unfortunately, this is a bit rushed, but I want to leave a couple of minutes to be able to look at the questions from participants. So I will just ask Sandra if there were a couple of questions that we could answer quickly. Otherwise, I can see a number of them on the Q&A function, just to say that we can continue this conversation on the CAFA community of practice, and we will be putting the link in any second. So Sandra, were there any questions for our panelists?
Yes, lots of questions actually. Unfortunately, we won't be able to respond to all of them. So indeed, we will continue the conversation on the community of practice. Maybe one that we could quickly address, that one I think is for Marianela. To what extent do governments cooperate with you to protect children from joining armed groups?
That's a great question. And let me do like a reverse explanation of what is our work. When you ask people in general in the communities, what do you need in order to prevent the recruitment and use of children, they always asking for security. We need basic security. Basic security is the physical and mental, and that you will be able just to exist. When you have that basic level, other things start to be able to management into relation, that the communities start to develop their own path to overcome many other issues that they have. So for the Dallaire Institute, that is exactly the approach. Okay, so who is in the organizations and the institutions the main actor that can make directly and important changes? So security forces are a main part of the problem, and I am a main part of the solution. So this is where we are very into not only for the origin of the institute that are linking with a general that was part of the UN mission in the genocide of Rwanda, but because it's one of the pillars to really create bases to develop other kind of prevention and other kind of interventions. So the good question is how many or how much the governments. So it's a very thing and very varied. So the relationships that we develop are the key issues in relation to how working with governments. And we, as I mentioned that through the early warning and the early actions model that we have, we develop all this, not only forecast, because it's more than the forecasting that what is going on. We also, in the same process, develop knowledge and partnerships with people, with academics, with policymakers, and with governments and in the areas in order to really finding key aspects that is related with the region. No, like as I mentioned, we don't have an abstract model that we're going to apply everywhere. No, this is a communication to open avenues to in specific regions that we are looking for as the factors that are showing us that the recruitment and use of children is going to happen. We starting, as I mentioned, in Mozambique to develop engagements with the main actors that in each region and in each country will be different. The other two panelists has been mentioned a couple things that are basic in that kind of relations. Building trust. Building trust is one of the main aspects that is required to do any enterprise in prevention. This is one of the things that we open spaces to have a dialogue. Doing what? First of all, is to putting children's rights at front. So anyone who wanted to working in human rights issues in a country has to put the children's rights at front, and that create a commonality between many topics that government, that society, and that community need.
Thank you, Marianela.
Sorry.
No, I'm sorry. I'm really sorry. It's just that we only have a minute left. Thank you so much. That was really interesting to hear as well. And I like the way you tied in the other contributions as well. So thank you. So we're really at a time. As we mentioned, we would like this conversation to continue, and we would really like to be able to, for our panelists to be able to answer your questions. I have been looking now, and there are loads. So if you haven't registered for the CAFA Community of Practice, you can do so by following the link that has been posted in the chat. And then we will be finding you there. I believe, Sandra, in the following days, our panelists will be checking and will be able to provide answers. Is that right?
Yeah, exactly.
Great. So, cool.
And,
yes.
Yeah, so I just wanted to say before we close, first we wanted to thank all our panelists and also inform all the participants that we have another session on how to do advocacy. So this is also a workshop that we are planning to do in a couple of weeks. And so if you are interested, we're gonna post a link in the chat. This is a mini workshop on how to do local advocacy on CAFAG. So where you will have practical tools and tips on how to do advocacy. So you need to register to the Alliance meeting first, and then you can attend the session, which will be on Wednesday, 14th. So I'm just gonna paste the information in the chat.
Great, thank you for that. And so thank you again to all our panelists today, Chiara, Marianela, Juan, and Dennis, of course. Sorry, the time wasn't sufficient as it often is. Thank you. And if participants who are still online wouldn't mind filling it's a little piece of feedback. So we have a Zoom poll link coming up for you. Oh, actually is popping up. So it's only 2 questions, it's very quick, and it will really help us gather feedback on our webinar series. Thank you very much, everyone. Yes, we hope you enjoyed it, and we hope to continue the conversation on the community of practice. Thank you. Have nice days ahead.
Thank you,
Thank
everybody.
you.
Have a great day.
Bye. Bye, Marianela, Dennis.